All right, so follow this line of thinking with me. Boaz is the second closest redeemer to Mahlon and Elimelech. So he knows that there's a first one. He knows that there's a guy closer. He knows his name. He knows who he is. But look how he addresses him. He says, turn aside, friend, and sit down here. Okay, he doesn't give him a name, and none of the verses in the story he has a name. And literally the Hebrew means so-and-so. So it's, hey, so-and-so, come here. Even though he knows his name, he chooses not to give him a name. Okay, which is important in the story. What is left out. Okay. So verse 2, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here, and so they sat down there. And so Boaz wants to make this official. Okay, he doesn't want this deal happen on the side. He wants people, witnesses, to be there to make sure that if this guy says no to redeeming Ruth and the land, that he wants to be able to officially say, yes, she's mine. Okay? So he's making it official. Verse 3, then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it. And I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. So what happens is Naomi has land in Bethlehem. The problem is that she cannot run the land herself. That's a male job, male-driven world, whatever. And so there needs to be a man there to hire to do the work of the field. And so that's what one part of the kinsman redeemer, they come and they buy the land. And they work the land and they keep the land in the family lineage. Okay? And so this guy, so-and-so, what he's hearing is, hey, you want to buy some land and add land to the land you already have? And as most people would smartly say, they'd say, yeah, I want to add some land. That increases my inheritance and increases my land and the amount of money I can make. It makes very wise sense to be able to purchase this. But in verse 5, it says, then Boaz says, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate in the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. And so Boaz says, oh, on top of buying this land, when you do that, you are also, it sounds bad in our language, but he's literally purchasing Ruth along with it. And so that's how it legally is, but don't think of it as like that. It's not as bad as it sounds, if that makes sense. He's not, so, but what happens is that if he does that, if he brings Ruth into his inheritance as well, not only now does he have to provide for Ruth and for the kids they're going to have, but that land he's buying isn't his. It belongs to their firstborn son. And so it went from being, oh, cool, I'm going to have more land, to, oh, I have to take a wife, and the land's not even mine because our firstborn son, it'll belong to him, and carry on the lineage of Mahlon. And so he says, I cannot take it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. And then he says, take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. And this is the high point of the love story in the movie. This is when the music gets really big, and we realize, you thought for a second, oh no, Boaz and Ruth aren't going to get married, this isn't going to happen. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, they're going to get married. It's going to happen. It's that point. It's the high point of the movie. It's awesome. It's the awesome scene. The music's going, and the doors open now for Boaz to take Ruth. And note how he said, Ruth the Moabite. Okay? Despite the fact that she comes unclean and she comes from a sinful people, Boaz still wants Ruth. Okay, despite that fact. So verse 7. Now this was the custom in former times. So remember now back to Deuteronomy 25, because that's going to come back up right now. Now this was the custom in the former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off the sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. And so literally, like, it seems kind of weird to take off your shoe and give it to somebody, but it's as if you're giving them a contract. That's the Israelite equivalent of giving a contract, is giving a sandal. So, verse 8, when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal, and then Boaz said to the elders of the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilon and to Mahlon. Also, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place, and you are witnesses this day. And so Boaz does exactly what he wants to do. He buys the land, and he gets the right to marry Ruth. Okay? Because for Boaz, this wasn't a transaction. He didn't buy her, he gets her. Okay? Boaz genuinely loved and cared and took care of Ruth, and he's not purchasing her, he is getting her. Ruth the Moabite. Every time Ruth's name is mentioned, it's pretty much mentioned Ruth the Moabite. Okay, they're constantly pointing to this fact that she's unclean, and Boaz doesn't care. He still wants her. Okay. Verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate and at elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. And may you act worthily in Ephrathah, and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar born to Judah, because the offspring of the Lord will give you this woman. Okay? And so what he's saying here is when he's saying, may your house be like Rachel and Leah. These are two people from Genesis who they were barren. They could not have kids, and then God blessed them and opened their wombs, and they were able to have children. And so they know Ruth does not have any kids, and they're saying, may God bless her and bless you too, the same way that he blessed Rachel and Leah and give you guys a child. And then it says, may you act worthily, and they're giving a blessing to Boaz. Okay, and so that comes to the end of that story. And so then verse 13 on, it says, so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. And exactly what and then she becomes like Rachel and Leah, and they have a son almost immediately. And it's a son, and it carries on not only the lineage of Mahlon, but also it carries on the lineage to David in the future. And who is David in the future? Huh? Do you know? Who is David? He's a king. Yeah, King David. He is the second king, the great king, the one who Jesus is referred to, or is referred to being like. Ruth is in the lineage of Jesus in Matthew, in the beginning of that book, saying that Ruth is in the lineage of Jesus. So not only is she here in this story, but literally Jesus comes from her lineage, from this happening. Jesus comes. Okay? And so let's look at a few of these love stories that we see. Okay? The first one is Ruth's love of Naomi. Okay. She was faithful to her. Naomi, no doubt, they had conversations about her God, and she more than likely compared him to the gods of Moab and said, this God's better. And so when it came time to make a decision to stay in Moab or go with Naomi, Ruth was loyal and loved Naomi, and she remained with her. Okay? She put Naomi's needs before her own needs, because Naomi was very downtrodden. She was very sad. She was leaving Moab empty, losing her wife and losing her husband and her kids, and Ruth stayed with her and thought of her needs. Okay? And so the second one is Boaz's love for Ruth. Okay, we already talked about this a little bit as we were going through, but this is something that as girls who are approaching the age or probably already dating now, Boaz, this relationship of Boaz and Ruth is one that you should take a second look at. And look at the qualities that Boaz has, and look for those godly qualities that we see here and someone that you want to date and to let into your life. Because Boaz is seen. He's seen as a kind man who thinks of and takes care of himself as well as others. Okay? We saw over and over again, he let Ruth harvest in his field. He gave her extra. Okay? He loved her and took care of her. Okay? He does righteous, godly actions. Okay? And we see him doing that and redeeming Ruth and Naomi's land. Okay? Boaz was a man who got things done. Okay? He didn't go into the city gates at midday hoping to find the other redeemer there. No, he went at the beginning of the day knowing he wanted to wait for him to show up. Okay? He's a man who gets things done, a go-getter. And he loves deeply. Okay? And so just as you guys should look at Boaz, the characteristics of Boaz for someone who you should let into your life and date, you should also look at the characteristics of Ruth and try to put them into the type of woman that you should strive for. Okay, she was hardworking. We saw that she worked from the early morning to the late night. Okay, she was a hard worker. She was a loyal woman in that her staying with Naomi. Okay, she was kind and she loved deeply. And also, Ruth trusted and worshiped God. Okay, she says, I will go and I will worship your God. Where you go, I will go. That's what she told Naomi. Okay. The third one is God's love for Naomi. Okay, this wasn't really brought out in what we talked about, but if you look at it, Naomi had a husband, she had 2 sons. God had blessed her with that. She left and she came back empty. Okay, she said, I went away full and came back empty. But God, and you see, if we would have kept reading, that the child that Boaz and Ruth had was a blessing to her. Okay, it filled her heart with joy